Following the end of the Second World War, a wave of decolonization swept through the old European empires. These struggles for independence often turned violent, as the colonial powers intervened militarily or rival revolutionaries clashed over diverging visions of the future. To make matters worse, these wars of decolonization were drawn out by Cold War superpower competition, with the opposing sides being used as proxies by the Communist East or Capitalist West. A conflict that stands out from this trend of Cold War decolonization was the so-called Rhodesian Bush War, which lasted from 1965 until 1980 in modern-day Zimbabwe. The British colony of Rhodesia declared itself independent in 1965, not to decolonize, but to maintain its colonial legacy. Rhodesia was ruled by a minority of white settlers, numbering around 230,000 in a country of almost 5 million. Britain refused to grant independence to Rhodesia until a system of majority rule was implemented that shared power equally. This was unacceptable to Rhodesia's ruling minority, as they feared for their safety and prosperity should power suddenly be shared. Frustrated by Britain's insistence on majority rule, Rhodesia unilaterally declared itself independent on the 11th of November 1965. The conflict that followed could be called a rebellion against a rebellion, as African nationalists, supported by the communist world, turned to violence to overthrow the unrecognized Rhodesian state. The Rhodesian Bush War lasted for 15 years and pitted Rhodesia's small and under-equipped security forces against a growing insurgency. While the insurgents enjoyed superpower support and were free to use neighboring countries as staging areas, Rhodesia remained an internationally sanctioned pariah-state, relying on clandestine imports and improvisation to maintain its military. Necessity is the mother of invention, however. The Rhodesian Security Forces developed some daring tactics to make the most out of their limited means. The most famous is Fireforce, an aggressive aerial encirclement that used air mobility to trap large groups of insurgents in the jaws of Rhodesian firepower. It combined rapid helicopter landings, low-altitude parachute drops, and overhead airstrikes into a devastating cauldron that was dropped on unsuspecting insurgents in mere minutes. Fireforce was an almost reckless tactic, taking major risks to maximize insurgent losses. Yet it proved highly effective, producing some of the most staggeringly lopsided casualty counts of modern war. The Rhodesian Light Infantry, the undisputed masters of Fireforce, inflicted 35 enemy casualties for each of their own, making it one of the most lethal units in military history. In the end, Rhodesia's bid for independence proved hopeless in the face of global isolation. But in the many years it took for this realization to set in, its security forces had honed themselves into one of the most lethal counterinsurgents of the 20th century. This episode of Teaching Tactics will explore the inner workings of Rhodesia's Fire Force. First, it will delve into the unique background of the Rhodesian War to explain how Fire Force came to be. Secondly, the organization and equipment that made Fire Force possible will be shown using the Rhodesian Light Infantry as an example. Finally, a Fire Force mission will be recreated in detail, providing a step-by-step overview of the tactic in action. You're watching Digital Battlefield Tours, and this is Teaching Tactics. At first sight, Fire Force seems almost too reckless to have ever worked. Using Second World War-era transport planes to drop paratroopers within rifle range of the enemy, circling the battlefield in tiny unarmored helicopters, placing 4-man teams directly into the path of the enemy, and using modified civilian aircraft to throw locally made ordnance in close support of your own forces. It is only in the unique context of the Rhodesian Bush War that this daring tactic was not just viable, but optimal. It was the fusion of Rhodesian political goals, military means, and geography that made Fire Force what it was. No analysis of Fire Force is possible without first exploring these three realms. On the political level, a fundamental misunderstanding of the conflict led the Rhodesian political leadership to favor an enemy-centric approach, one that sought to outkill the insurgency through tactics such as Fireforce, instead of a population-centric approach that sought to secure the support of the people. The Rhodesian War was an insurgency, and an insurgency is an inherently political struggle. It is waged between opposing ideologies over the future of a state. The counter-insurgent seeks to maintain his ruling position, while the insurgent seeks to overthrow it. The battleground is the population, whose help can make or break an insurgency. An ideology cannot be defeated in a pitched battle. It is only defeated by convincing the population that it is in their long-term interest to support the counter-insurgent. Winning this support, the famous hearts and minds, goes beyond militarily enforcing your will. It must include things such as good governance, economic development and improvements in daily life that convince the populace that your rule is the better rule. The military plays a supporting role in the counter-insurgency effort. It provides the necessary security so these political, economic and social programs can take effect. Only occasionally can the military take the initiative and hunt down the elusive insurgents. The counter-insurgent in the Rhodesian War did not see it this way. The unrecognized Rhodesian state, governed by the Rhodesian Front Party under Prime Minister Ian Smith, underestimated the internal political side of the war and instead framed it as a battle against the spread of international communism. Its paternalism towards the native African population blinded the government to the underlying spread of African nationalism. It instead blamed foreign communist agitators for sowing discontent. This self-delusion reinforced the Rhodesian belief that the insurgency could be defeated by simply outkilling the agitators. Instead of asking the question if holding on to minority rule was a feasible political goal, the Rhodesian Front doubled down on its self-image as a bastion against international communism, and took insurgent body counts as a measure for success. The insurgents, on the other hand, knew exactly what kind of war they were waging. ZAPU and ZANU, working together as the Patriotic Front from 1976 onwards, were fighting a long-term political insurgency. They aligned themselves with the communist world, but when it came to Rhodesia, they spread a message of African nationalism that played into local history, culture and tribal identity. It was a much clearer message for the poor rural population than the Rhodesian government's well-meaning paternalism. Whereas Rhodesia was a heavily sanctioned pariah state, the insurgents received material support and training from the communist world. Zanla, the armed wing of ZANU, proved especially adept at the Maoist method of insurgency it had adopted from its Chinese backer. It fully embraced the asymmetry of the conflict, making no effort to compete with the Rhodesian Security Forces militarily, but focusing solely on irregular warfare. Zanla insurgents built up their influence in the poor borderlands first, using propaganda and intimidation to set up support networks among the local population. From there on, the insurgents spread out to threaten key Rhodesian areas, such as the farms, the mines and the highways. Terror attacks against these high-profile targets tied down more and more of the Rhodesian Security Forces, thus leaving ever larger rural areas unguarded for the insurgents to take over. Rhodesia's political preference for an enemy-centric approach was amplified at the military level by the Rhodesian Security Forces. They lacked both the numbers and the will to make a population-centric approach possible. Instead, they took a quality over quantity decision, concentrating their small core of elite troops and air assets into specialist search-and-destroy units, optimized around finding and eliminating insurgents using Fireforce. Starting with manpower, the Rhodesian Security Forces remained hopelessly small. Manpower was drawn from a small and shrinking pool of white conscripts and career soldiers and increasingly rare black volunteers. In a country of nearly 5 million, the combined Rhodesian security forces numbered in the low tens of thousands, many of whom were part-time reservists that couldn't be deployed for long without damaging the economy. The majority of the Rhodesian security forces were relatively low-intensity security units, ranging from locally recruited guard forces and the national police to territorial Rhodesian army units. Only a small part of the already small Rhodesian army was deemed qualified enough to work with the Air Force in high-intensity Fire Force missions. Another major factor was the limited and inadequate equipment Rhodesian forces had to work with due to the international sanctions. Most high-tech hardware was aging British legacy equipment, with black market smuggling, clever improvisation and clandestine deals with South Africa making up the rest. Like with the manpower, shortages led to specialization. Especially the prized aviation assets were almost fully dedicated to Fireforce by the end of the war. The necessity to make the most out of these limited means was an important step in creating Fireforce. But there were also immaterial influences at play, what could be called a Rhodesian way of war, the culture and history of the armed forces that drew them towards a kill-centric approach. Modern, population-centric counterinsurgency methods weren't unknown to Rhodesia's military leadership. Before the breakup with Great Britain, Rhodesia had helped in the Malayan emergency as part of a Commonwealth force during the 1950s. This conflict was highly influential in the development of modern counterinsurgency theory. While some of these methods were subsequently implemented in Rhodesia, most notably the protected villages, psychological operations and local auxiliaries, many of these efforts ran into skepticism from Rhodesian political and military leaders and underperformed due to chronic underfunding, thus further reinforcing the belief that outkilling the insurgents was the better strategy. A preference for conventional warfare was another part of Rhodesian military culture. Especially the Rhodesian army remained bound to its duty as a conventional military force, which was shaped by its significant contribution to the Commonwealth during the Second World War. The prospect of conventional war with a near-peer adversary, no matter how unlikely, continued to influence Rhodesian army training and organization. This preference also shaped Fireforce, as the tactic was based around the use of air mobility to trap the elusive insurgents in the type of conventional battle the Rhodesians excelled at. Besides its Commonwealth service, another important influence in Rhodesia's military history were the wars of imperial conquest that led to its founding. These were waged in the late 19th century, long before hearts and minds and the population-centric approach existed. Instead, the counter-insurgents of the time often waged punitive campaigns that sought to create a decisive so-called moral effect through the use of surprise and overwhelming force. It was based on the premise that continuous heavy losses would eventually break the will of the insurgents, thus justifying an enemy-centric approach as a war-winning strategy. This line of thinking still dominated during the Bush War, as causing massive insurgent casualties was intended to demoralize the movement and scare away recruits. So, like the Rhodesian government, the security forces were drawn to an enemy-centric approach. They thought they could win the war by inflicting devastating losses on the enemy, and to this end they poured their extremely limited resources into a tactic optimized for lethality: Fireforce. The final key to Fireforce was geography. Rhodesia was a large country, roughly the size of California or about 1.5 times the United Kingdom. Many areas were sparsely inhabited and infrastructure was limited, typically only connecting key areas. The terrain varied from sun-scorched plains to cooler tree-covered mountains, and the fauna included dangerous wildlife. Most of Rhodesia's borders were shared with nations opposed to its existence. Especially Zambia, and from 1975 on Mozambique, provided massive staging areas for the insurgents. Stemming the flow of infiltrators along this vast border was simply impossible, meaning most insurgents were already well dispersed within the interior of Rhodesia by the time the security forces picked up their trail. This meant air mobility was essential. The only way that Rhodesia's small security forces could react to roaming insurgent activity was to fly over the vast wilderness and strike from the sky. The political and military preference for killing, the small but highly competent security forces, the militarily incapable insurgents, and the vast distances of the Rhodesian countryside thus came together to create Fireforce, a daring tactic that used air mobility to fly Rhodesia's elite troops over the vast wilderness, using speed and surprise to trap the elusive insurgents in a devastating ring of fire they could not hope to escape from. It was the escalation of insurgent activity in 1974 that proved the catalyst for Fireforce. The Rhodesian SAS, in an effort to stem the tide of insurgent infiltrations, started working with Rhodesian Air Force helicopters to develop aggressive search-and-destroy tactics. The military performance of the insurgents, once they were cornered, proved so weak that the Rhodesians took ever greater risks to increase their body counts. The helicopters started flying closer, airstrikes were thrown in, and finally, in an effort to up the skill of Fireforce, paratroopers were introduced. The results proved devastating. Fireforce pitted some of the most trained, motivated and experienced soldiers in the world against insurgents who could barely fire a rifle. This was the downside of Zanla's irregular tactics. Most of its troops were hastily recruited villagers, told to place mines and avoid the security forces at all costs. They stood little chance against the destructive power of a fire force. Without warning, they were trapped in a fight they could not hope to win, surrounded on all sides and mercilessly struck from the air. Chasing insurgent body counts proved to be a losing strategy in the end, but it certainly honed Rhodesia's tiny military into a devastating killing machine, inflicting disproportionate losses up to the very end. No single unit had a monopoly on Fireforce. Its practitioners ranged from the elite Rhodesian SAS to the more regular Rhodesian African rifles. But it was the RLI, the Rhodesian Light Infantry, who became most proficient with it. From 1977 onwards, the RLI became Rhodesia's prime quick reaction force. The battalion stationed its company-sized subunits on Fireforce bases across Rhodesia, where they stood poised to strike insurgent gatherings. The RLI had closely integrated air assets of the Rhodesian Air Force at its disposal, which enabled the light infantrymen to strike anywhere, no matter how remote, and be backed up by heavy aerial firepower. In terms of manpower, the RLI was a small, segregated unit, relying on volunteers to fill its ranks. From 1973 onwards, the long-serving career soldiers were supplemented and eventually outnumbered by national service conscripts who could volunteer to serve with the RLI for the more limited duration of their national service. Foreign volunteers were also welcomed into the RLI, turning it into a Rhodesian Foreign Legion of sorts. The percentage of foreigners grew to over 10% of the RLI's strength and included 38 different nationalities. Besides many South Africans, the RLI also included American and Australian veterans of the Vietnam War, former British soldiers and ex-legionnaires of the French Foreign Legion. The upside of this self-imposed shortage of manpower was that the RLI remained a small but elite unit with a strong sense of identity and pride. Even the national service conscripts, despite not being soldiers by choice, fit in well with the Rhodesian regulars and foreign volunteers. The structure of the RLI went through some changes during the course of the war, but overall it retained its basic layout as a British-style commando battalion. This mostly affected the names of the subunits compared to a regular infantry battalion. Instead of companies, the RLI had 3 so-called commandos, led by a major or captain and around 100 men strong. Instead of platoons, the commandos were made up of so-called troops, usually 4 per commando and typically led by a lieutenant. Squad-sized patrols were sometimes used, but typically the RLI preferred to organize its troops into 4-man sticks, led by a corporal. Just like a regular infantry battalion, the RLI concentrated its heavy weapons and specialists in a 4th so-called support commando. This unit included a mortar troop, anti-tank troop, assault pioneer troop and reconnaissance troop. This concentration of specialists in a separate commando proved unsuited for dispersed counterinsurgency actions, so instead the support commando typically functioned just like the other commandos, performing its own fire force actions as light infantry. Still, they kept proficient in their specializations, so they could revert to their more conventional support role if needed. Finally, the base group functioned as a non-combat support element and headquarters for the entire battalion. Base group took care of administration, transportation, communications, medical care and other vital supporting tasks. The RLI was rarely deployed as a full battalion. Instead, its 4 commandos, with attached elements from base group, were deployed across Rhodesia on different fire force bases. Each commando was responsible for independently conducting fire forces within its area of operations. Crucially, each commando worked with closely integrated air assets of the Rhodesian Air Force. So, to understand the organization behind Fireforce, one must look at an RLI commando and its attached air assets. When it comes to the organization of an RLI Fireforce commando, the only certainty is that it was always under strength. The paper allotment of 130 men was almost never reached. Instead, commandos had to make do with numbers as low as just 70 men. It even proved necessary at times to bring the clerks and cooks of base group along on a mission. While a commando had platoon-sized troops as subunits, its real tactical building block was the 4-man stick. A stick consisted of a leader, a machine gunner, and 2 riflemen. Most sticks were led by a corporal or senior trooper, while some were led by a lieutenant who would also be in command of nearby sticks belonging to his troop. The troop medic was also integrated into one of the troop sticks. Communications were vital in the dense Rhodesian bush, so the stick leader carried a small radio that connected him to the other sticks and the Fireforce commander. In case of radio failure, colored flares and smoke and a reflective orange panel were carried to signal to the helicopters. The second man in the stick was the machine gunner, carrying the FN MAG. This belt-fed, general-purpose machine gun was a heavy weapon for use in such a small team, but the Rhodesians greatly valued the firepower it gave every stick. The MAG's large caliber, typically fed from a 50-round belt, easily cut through the thick Rhodesian bush, killing or suppressing any insurgents lying in wait. The MAG was often used in a very mobile role, fired from the hip at suspected ambush positions while moving forward. Spare barrels were rarely taken along on a Fireforce mission, but plenty of ammunition belts were carried by all members of the stick. The other 2 men in the stick were riflemen, equipped with the FN FAL, just like the stick leader. One rifleman could act as a grenadier and fire high-explosive rifle grenades. These were valued for their ability to hit insurgents in low-lying terrain, such as dry riverbeds. The 4th rifleman typically carried a first aid kit for emergency medical care until the specialized troop medic arrived. The FAL rifle that armed the majority of the stick fired the same 7.62 by 51mm rifle cartridge as the MAG, simplifying resupply and offering the same barrier penetration and lethality. Rhodesian FALs were select fire, meaning they could also fire in fully automatic mode, but the hefty recoil and limited 20-round magazines rarely made this practical. Marksmanship training instead emphasized quick snap shooting against unexpected targets at close range. The rifles were optimized for bush warfare by removing slings and carrying handles, taping together magazines, and painting the rifles in a yellow-green camouflage pattern. Additional weaponry could include a 9mm pistol and hand-thrown fragmentation and white phosphorus grenades. Uniforms and webbing differed widely. Most troopers preferred to stay light, going so far as wearing t-shirts, shorts and sports shoes into battle and darkening their exposed skin with camouflage cream. Others stuck with the regulation camouflage fatigues, which provided better protection against the discomforts of the Rhodesian bush. Different patterns of webbing were worn, some made locally, others brought in from abroad, and some even captured from insurgents and made to fit FAL magazines. An RLI commando typically deployed 3 of its troops on a Fireforce mission, 1 as a helicopter wave, 1 as a parachute wave, and a 3rd as the so-called land tail. The 4th troop would be kept on base as a reserve force. The helicopter and parachute waves dropped directly into combat, while the land tail followed by road and acted as reinforcements. Allocation to a wave was rotated at the troop level to avoid combat exhaustion. Starting with the helicopter wave, this consisted of 4 helicopters of the Rhodesian Air Force's No. 7 Squadron. They flew the Alouette 3, a small and light helicopter crewed by a pilot and gunner technician. It was mostly unarmored and its troop carrying and armament options were limited. Simply carrying its crew of 2 and an infantry stick of 4 already pushed the machine to its limits. It certainly had no business being as close to ground fire as the Rhodesians used it, but they had no alternatives until a small number of Bell UH-1 Hueys became available in the final year of the war. Despite their flaws, it were these precious few Alouettes that made Fireforce possible, and the Rhodesians took great care to keep them in flying condition. Of the 4 helicopters assigned to a commando, 3 were the so-called G-car variants. These were designed for troop transport and were only armed with a side-mounted machine gun operated by the Air Force gunner. By rearranging the seating, the Rhodesians managed to just barely fit a stick of 4 men into a G-car, which led to 4-man sticks becoming the RLI standard combat unit. One of the 3 sticks was usually led by a lieutenant who would also be in charge of the other 2 helicopter sticks. The 4th helicopter was the so-called K-car. The special Alouette was part gunship, part flying command post. The commander of the RLI commando would be seated in the K-car, giving him a bird's eye view of the battlefield. From his flying command post, the commander could contact his sticks by radio, coordinate airstrikes and report enemy positions. Additionally, the K-car was armed with an automatic 20mm cannon firing high explosive shells. This was a French post-war copy of the German MG-151 aircraft cannon, which the Luftwaffe had used with devastating effect during the Second World War. The Rhodesians mounted the weapon on the left side of the helicopter, where it was operated by an Air Force gunner sitting behind it. The K-car flew counterclockwise circles over the battlefield, giving the gunner an elevated, orbiting firing position. This continuous pinpoint fire made the K-car's cannon one of the deadliest weapons in the Rhodesian arsenal. The 3 G-cars of the helicopter wave could only carry 12 men in total. Because more boots on the ground were needed, the Rhodesians added a parachute wave to their Fire Force actions. Planes were provided by the Air Force's No. 3 Squadron. These were World War II-era C-47 Dakotas. They were so old that one of the planes was even said to have taken part in the 1944 drop over Arnhem. Just one Dakota was usually assigned to a Fire Force commando, which could carry 5 sticks of 20 men total. A lieutenant usually led one of these sticks while also acting as troop commander for the others. The 32 men of the helicopter and parachute waves were the first on the ground. If needed, the G-cars could return to base to pick up additional sticks if these were available. Otherwise, it was common for reinforcements to follow by road, the so-called landtil. The Rhodesians used a number of different troop transport vehicles. Some of them, such as the Crocodile, were civilian trucks that were modified into mine-resistant armored personnel carriers. The landtil usually arrived after the action was over to take care of casualties and prisoners, collect weapons and parachutes and refuel the helicopters. If a large group of insurgents escaped the Fire Force, the landtil could track them down or set up an ambush. A Fire Force commando typically had its own fixed-wing air support in the form of the Lynx. This was a militarized version of the commercially available Cessna Skymaster, a small twin-engine plane valued for its short takeoff distance. Called the Lynx in Rhodesian service and flown by No. 4 Squadron, it was outfitted with fixed roof-mounted machine guns and underwing mounting points for bombs and rockets. Among its payload options were locally made napalm, called Frantan by the Rhodesians, a downsized version of the devastating golf bomb developed by the Rhodesian Air Force, and unguided rocket pods. The Lynx was slow and unarmored, but could loiter over the battlefield for the duration of a fire force. Its high wing placement gave it excellent downward visibility, which, coupled with its slow speed, allowed for precision strikes. The Lynx was powered by 2 engines driving separate propellers, which were arrayed in a push-pull configuration. One propeller in the nose pulls the aircraft, while the second propeller in the rear pushes it. Should one of the engines get taken out by ground fire, the Lynx could still retreat to safety on its other engine. The final resort to overwhelming firepower came from outside the commando, in the form of the bombing squadrons of the Rhodesian Air Force. These flew Canberras and Hawker Hunters that stood on 24-hour standby on airfields across the country. Calling in these planes for a Fire Force action was exceptional, however. They could only do a pre-planned strike against a clearly defined target and would endanger nearby troops. Bombing strikes were typically reserved for large cross-border raids against insurgent bases, or as a last resort if ground troops found themselves overwhelmed. The organization of a Fire Force commando is reflective of the larger Rhodesian War. Limited means were expertly forged together to make optimal use of them, yielding impressive short-term results, but ultimately proving unsustainable for the long-term duration of the war. What amounted to a chronically understrength company of light infantry, supported by a handful of aircraft, was responsible for all Fire Force callouts in a massive part of Rhodesia, sometimes going on multiple missions a day. If all went well, the results were impressive. Fire Force actions caused the majority of insurgent casualties with comparatively few Rhodesian losses. But the war went on, regardless of how many insurgents were killed. Meanwhile, the manpower pool for the segregated RLI was reaching the bottom, and the aging airframes it relied on so heavily were never getting replaced. By 1979, the RLI had exhausted itself winning battles in a lost war. Fire Force actions came in many shapes and sizes. Some were closer in scale to an aerial patrol, while others were massive cross-border operations involving multiple RLI commandos, special forces and most of the Rhodesian Air Force. One of the most common types of Fire Force was one conducted by an RLI commando against an insurgent gathering within the borders of Rhodesia. Generally speaking, these fire forces came in two varieties. The first one was a quick reaction force, which was called in to reinforce an existing battle, such as an insurgent ambush or attack on a farmstead. The second one was a Search-and-Destroy fire force, which was based on reports of insurgent activity. The second type was often the most successful, as the insurgents would be caught by surprise, often with their leadership present and in a hideout with weapons and supplies. But these were also much harder to track down, relying on solid intelligence from cooperative locals, outposts and patrols. Most of all, Fire Force was a flexible tactic. It had to be adapted to the terrain, available forces and enemy strength. Some were done without a parachute element, others without the support from the links. Still, the core theory behind Fire Force gave every action a similar setup. The goal was to use air mobility to trap insurgents in a high firepower fight they could not hope to win. The insurgents knew they were completely outgunned, so their only response was to scatter in all directions and run as soon as they heard the helicopters approaching. This made speed and surprise the key to a successful fire force. It had to trap as many insurgents as possible within its ring of fire before they fled. A fire force typically consisted of 4 phases. The opening phase relied on the surprise application of heavy aerial firepower. The goal was to inflict maximum casualties on the insurgents while they were still concentrated. This was typically done by the cannon of the K-car and the bombs and rockets of the Lynx. If available, the even heavier ordnance of the Air Force's Hunters or cameras could be added to this opening stage. The shock and devastation of this sudden attack opened the way for the second phase, the placement of ground troops. They would land around the insurgents to create a broom and dustpan. The 3 helicopter sticks, acting as so-called stops, functioned as the dustpan, while the parachute sticks formed a line that swept through the area like a broom, driving the surviving insurgents towards the waiting stops. This sweep was the third phase of the action. Finally, the fourth phase was the consolidation. The landtail arrived to help resupply, search the surroundings and track down any surviving insurgents. The following segment will show these actions in more detail. It features an example fire force recreated from multiple sources. The first step in launching a successful fire force was knowing when and where to strike. Insurgents operated in small and highly mobile groups that were hard to pin down. The Rhodesian Security Forces used a number of intelligence gathering methods, from classic bush tracking to air reconnaissance, local informants and captured insurgents. In this example, a scout team has been monitoring a village from a concealed observation post on the southern hilltop. They have deduced that a gathering of around 50 insurgents is using the wooded area east of the village as a temporary camp. It won't be long before they disperse again into smaller groups. The scouts have called in the fire force by radio and will continue to observe until its arrival. The call is received by the headquarters of the RLI commando stationed on a nearby airfield. A siren sends the troops in a scramble towards their aircraft. The 3 sticks assigned to the helicopters grab their gear and rush on board. The parachute sticks need a little more time to strap into their harnesses, but will easily catch up once the Dakota is airborne. All elements are in the air within minutes. The landtail mounts its trucks and leaves the base shortly after. Their journey will take the longest. All elements are now converging on the target area. The 4 helicopters fly in a spaced out column close to the ground. The Dakota and Lynx follow behind at a higher altitude. The commander of the fire force, a major, captain, or at times even a lieutenant, has to use the limited time of the approach journey to plan his action. He must choreograph the use of highly mobile and lethal weapons in a very restricted space and time frame. Employing his assets too loosely will let the insurgents get away, or worse, fight back against unsupported elements. Employing his assets too tightly can lead to accidents, as the airspace will be filled with circling helicopters, planes and paratroopers. Once on the ground, his sticks will disappear in the bush, putting them at constant risk of friendly fire from the air. To make things even harder, the fire force takes place in a nondescript stretch of countryside that the commander has never seen before. He is completely reliant on these scouts and his map to form a mental image of the situation. He must then formulate a plan based on these second-hand reports and communicate this plan by radio to all his pilots and stick leaders while they are already in the air. The helicopters reach the contact area, marking the start of Phase 1. They come in low and fast, the K-car with the Fire Force commander in the lead. They fly in over the heads of the scout team, so the commander can get a good final look at the train from their perspective. If all went well, the commander can recognize the situation instantly and order his elements into action. The helicopters are put into a counterclockwise circling pattern, flying low and at a set speed to give the K-car's gunner a consistent lead for his shells. An experienced gunner could often land direct hits. If insurgents sought cover, the gunner would target nearby rocks or trees to create a lethal spray of fragmentation. As the K-car does its deadly work, the Fire Force commander guides in the Lynx. Its bombs, rockets and napalm are best used in the beginning of the action, before friendly troops are on the ground. The Lynx loiters lazily outside small arms range, its high wing mounting giving the pilot an unobstructed view of the battlefield. When he spots his target, the pilot swoops his aircraft in, firing the roof-mounted machine guns to suppress ground fire before dropping his ordnance. The first phase has a devastating effect on the insurgents. They are suddenly caught by firepower they cannot hope to match. Their only recourse is to scatter and run, hoping that an unfortunate comrade draws fire instead of them. Trapping the remaining insurgents is where Phase 2 comes in, the placing of ground troops. The goal is to create a broom and dustpan. The 3 helicopter sticks function as the dustpan, lying in wait to ambush fleeing insurgents, while the 5 parachute sticks form the broom, sweeping through the area and driving the insurgents into the dustpan. The helicopter sticks, acting as the stop groups, are best placed overlooking natural escape routes, such as dry riverbeds and forest trails. Alternatively, they can occupy high ground. The paratroopers need a good stretch of clear ground to land on, but with enough distance from the insurgents to safely organize into a sweep line. The commander picks the open field directly east of the village as his drop zone. The helicopter sticks will land on the opposite side of the insurgents and take up ambush positions overlooking a low-lying forest trail that passes between the hills. The 3 G-cars spew out of the circle and descend to their landing zones. They may perform a false landing along the way to confuse the insurgents. The helicopters disappear among the trees, drop their sticks and then rejoin the K-car in its circling pattern. If needed and available, the G-cars may return to base to pick up a second wave of troops. As soon as they hit the ground, the 3 sticks make their way to their blocking positions, where they set up their MAGs to cover avenues of escape. While this is going on, the paratroopers arrive on the scene. The commander typically planned for the Dakota to arrive a minute or 2 after the helicopters, so the drop isn't unsupported. The Dakota comes in very low, typically around 150 meters or 500 feet. This is done to minimize the time the paratroopers hang in the air, as they are jumping within small arms range of the insurgents. From this height, the troops are out of the plane and on the ground in 20 seconds or less. The sticks must land closely together, so they are able to fight as a coherent unit as soon as they hit the ground. The jump is therefore made in close order, one trooper following right on the heels of the one before him. If all goes well, the sticks are out of the plane, out of their parachutes and in fighting formation in less than a minute. The second phase is the most vulnerable time for the Rhodesian troops, as they are either dangling from a parachute or sitting in a descending helicopter. Heavy suppressive fire is therefore placed on the insurgents by the K-car and the Lynx. The G-cars may join in with their door guns as they descend to land. The MAG gunner of the stick is seated in the opposite door, so both sides are covered by automatic weapons. If all went according to plan, the setup for the broom and dustpan is established in mere minutes after the first shot. The third phase is the sweep. Under the watchful eyes of the circling helicopters, the 20 paratroopers in the sweep line make their advance. A lieutenant is typically in command of one stick, but also controls the sweep line as a whole. The main task of the sweep line is to drive the surviving insurgents towards the stop groups. They use reconnaissance by fire, sending bursts of machine gun and rifle fire into the bush ahead of them as they advance. The thick Rhodesian bush was a great equalizer, allowing insurgents to ambush the advancing sticks at close range, where they couldn't be backed up from the air. If some insurgents decide to stand and fight, the entire sweep line concentrates its fire on their position. Sticks then rush forward and bounce, using fire and maneuver to close in until they can assault the position with hand grenades and point-blank fire. If a resistance nest is too strong, the sticks peel back so the K-car or Lynx can reduce it. Any insurgents fleeing the advance of the sweep line are likely to run into the fire of one of the 3 stop groups. Depending on the situation, these stop groups may instead perform mobile sweeps of their own. Searching the area could go on for a couple of hours. Eventually, the sweep would transition into the fourth and final phase, the consolidation. By this time, the landfill had usually arrived with welcome supplies. Dead and captive insurgents are gathered and searched, captured weapons collected, and any Rhodesian casualties evacuated. Parachutes are gathered for reuse, and the helicopters may need to land to fill up on aviation fuel that the trucks brought along. If a large group of insurgents managed to escape, the landfill would organize a tracking party to go after them. Alternatively, some sticks could spend the night at the scene of the Fireforce, ambushing insurgents who came back to investigate. A textbook Fireforce like this would only take a few hours. It would eliminate most of the insurgents and scatter the survivors into the wilderness. Yet many other Fireforce callouts turned out to be so-called lemons, false alarms that wouldn't encounter any enemies. Sometimes the insurgents had fled in time, turning a Fireforce action into a drawn-out search that could last into the night. An RLI commando may receive multiple callouts in a day, with some being lemons and others leading to combat. The example shown here should therefore be seen as the textbook version of Fireforce, showing the tactic to its fullest extent. In reality, many Fireforce actions took on a different form, depending on the forces available, the terrain, and enemy strength. One of the principal theories in the study of military history is that of the levels of war. A level of war relates to the scale at which military decision-making takes place. The 2 most agreed upon levels are the tactical and strategic. The tactical is the lower level and governs the ways in which battles are waged. The strategic level is the higher of the 2 and includes top-level military and political decisions that ultimately influence the entire war. Winning battles is done with tactics, but winning the war is ultimately done through strategy. Fireforce is a tactic, the enemy-centric approach is a strategy. Seen on its own as a tactic, Fireforce was incredibly successful. It did exactly what it was intended to do, use Rhodesia's limited military means to inflict devastating losses on the insurgents. As a tactic, Fireforce was also in harmony with Rhodesia's chosen strategy of an enemy-centric approach. The Rhodesians thought they could stop the insurgency by bleeding it dry, and Fireforce did this one battle at a time. According to Rhodesian strategic thinking, Fireforce was a war-winning tactic because the losses it inflicted would eventually break the will of the insurgents. While Fireforce was an excellent tactic, the enemy-centric strategy it served was deeply flawed. It was based on a misunderstanding of insurgent goals and an overestimation of Rhodesia's ability to sustain a long-term counterinsurgency. It forced the small and under-equipped security forces to fight a war of attrition against a coalition of superpower-supported insurgent groups who had no trouble replenishing their losses from Rhodesia's native population of nearly 5 million. The fact that Fireforce remained so effective at the tactical level, despite the worsening strategic situation, led to a positive feedback loop. As long as Fireforce was producing insurgent body counts, it kept up the illusion that the enemy-centric approach was working. The short-term tactical success of Fireforce blinded the Rhodesian leadership to the worsening long-term strategic situation. In a way, Fireforce was winning the Rhodesians towards defeat. Failure at the strategic level came back to haunt Fireforce in the final years of the war. The failing economy and growing insurgent violence led to widespread emigration, further restricting the manpower pool for segregated units like the RLI. International isolation took its toll on the handful of machines that made Fireforce possible, as these were thoroughly worn out after more than a decade without replacements. The good intelligence that was so crucial for Fireforce dried up, as the security forces lost control over the countryside and the population became uncooperative. Demoralization set in as it became increasingly clear that Rhodesia was a lost cause. So in the end, strategy asserted itself over tactics. Fireforce, no matter how successful it was as a tactic, served a losing strategy. It won battles while losing the war.